as Bridget said, I'm Victoria Russell, and I'm an associate professor of Spanish and foreign language education at Valdosta State University, which is a regional university in the University System of Georgia. Tonight, we're going to be talking about processing instruction, and it's possible that many of you might not know anything about it. So, we're going to begin by looking at what is it? Processing instruction, or PI, is an instructional technique that was created by Bill Van Patten, and it's based on the findings of research in the field of second language acquisition. So, therefore, it is a research based technique. It's also very important to understand that PI is a pedagogical technique and not an instructional method. Many researchers and scholars confuse PI for an instructional method. With instructional methods and approaches, we use those every day to teach all aspects of second and foreign languages. Processing instruction, on the other hand, is meant to be dropped in as an intervention when instructors anticipate that their students will have difficulty processing certain aspects of their input in the second language. Van Patten suggested that PI should be parachuted in when a processing problem is anticipated. I also want to mention that PI is completely input based. It's an input based approach to language instruction. The focus is on helping learners make correct form meaning connections when they process their input initially. Therefore, it is not necessary for students to produce the targeted forms in their output. According to Van Patten's model of input processing, only input is needed for acquisition to take place. Output is very useful for building fluency and accuracy in the second language, but it's a result of the acquisition that has already taken place. According to Van Patten, output is not a path to acquisition, and only input can affect the developing linguistic system. Input processing occurs when input is converted to intake. This is the area that is targeted by PI. So as you can see on the slide here, where the number 1 is, that is where the processing instruction is targeting, where input is converted to intake. PI has 3 components, which will be discussed in detail in the coming slides. The first component is an explicit explanation of grammar. The second is information on processing strategies, and the third component is structured input tasks and activities. The grammar explanation and the information on processing strategies provide explicit information to the learner. Some researchers argue that the explicit information component may not be necessary. They argue that maybe only the structured input activities are the only thing that's needed to bring about a beneficial effect. I'm going to show you some research findings regarding this debate at the end of this presentation. Since learners can only take in and process so much new information at once, Van Patten's guidelines for creating processing instruction state that instructors should only present one form or structure at a time. For example, in Spanish, which is the language that I teach, there are 6 inflections or verb endings for each type of verb. We have 3 types of verbs in Spanish, AR, ER, and IR. So for every tense, we have these 6 inflections to teach the students. Most foreign language textbooks are going to present all 6 inflections at once. This is known as the full paradigm of forms for a given tense. However, with processing instruction, grammar instruction should be non-paradigmatic because we're human beings. We have a limited capacity to process our input. Learners can only take in and process so much new information at one time, which is really about 7 to 9 chunks. In the example on this slide, only the first person, we see the singular and the plural of the first person of the verb estudiar in the present tense, is presented to the learners. With traditional instruction, learners are presented with the full paradigm of grammatical forms. In other words, they're going to be shown all six verb endings at once. Traditional instruction also provides an explicit explanation of the rules, which is typically followed by immediate output practice in the form of mechanical drills, grammar drills, mechanical drills. In other words, traditional instruction is forcing the learners to produce the targeted forms before they have acquired the targeted forms. Research has shown that this type of practice is ineffective because learners are only focusing on form rather than on meaning. With mechanical activities, with mechanical drill activities, students don't have to understand the meaning of the input sentences in order to answer items correctly. For example, the mechanical drill on this slide, the students could simply fill in the correct verb form without understanding the remainder of the sentence. According to processing instruction, acquisition should precede production. Therefore, the activities are designed to help learners process the new forms before they're required to produce them in their output. Information on processing strategies is perhaps the most unique aspect of PI. Van Patten's model of input processing provides a set of principles and sub-principles that describe how learners process or parse their linguistic input initially. According to the model, many of the strategies that learners engage in are faulty or flawed. This can cause misunderstandings. It can also cause delays in the acquisition process. It's important to note that second language learners can and very often do process their input incorrectly. And processing instruction is designed to help learners avoid faulty input processing strategies in favor of more optimal ones. Therefore, the goal of PI is to help learners make correct form meaning connections when they first process their input. The information on processing strategies component provides explicit information to learners on how to process the targeted form correctly. In 2004, Van Patten identified two main principles in his model: the primacy of meaning principle and the first noun principle. He claimed that these principles hold regardless of the learner's first language and regardless of the language being acquired. The primacy of meaning principle is perhaps the most important principle, and it has six sub-principles. This principle states that learners will process their input for meaning before they process it for form. In the example on this slide, Mary worked for 8 hours yesterday. Learners are going to focus on the content word yesterday to process meaning. In other words, they extract the meaning of the temporal reference of the sentence from the content word yesterday, rather than from the bound inflectional morpheme for the past tense in English, the ED. The second principle, which is the first noun principle, states that learners tend to process the first noun or pronoun that they encounter in a sentence as the subject or agent. In the example here, and I'm sorry if all of you don't understand Spanish, I will translate all of the Spanish examplos. But this example, Lo de Maria, most second language learners of Spanish will misinterpret this sentence because they will process the first noun that they see. The first word they see is lo. They're going to process that as the subject rather than as the direct object. They will think the sentence means he sees Maria, when in reality, it means Maria sees him. In Spanish, word order is much more fluid than in English. It can be subject, object, verb, object, verb, subject, as in this example, or simply object, verb, lo ve, which is the most common. In Spanish, dropping the subject pronoun is the most common technique, which leaves the object pronoun in the sentence initial position, where learners are going to process it incorrectly. With processing instruction, learners would be alerted to their tendency to process the first word that they encounter as the subject. They would be reminded that lo is not a subject pronoun, but rather an object pronoun, and that subject pronouns are very often dropped in Spanish. In Van Patten's model, the primacy of meaning principle has six sub principles, and the first noun principle has three sub principles. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover all of the sub principles this evening. However, on the very next slide, I'm going to show you one sub principle as an example. All of the other sub principles in the model are located in the Dig Deeper readings for this presentation, which is lesson 13. Sub-principle 1F is the sentence location principle, and it's a sub-principle of the primacy of meaning principle, which is principle 1. According to this sub-principle, learners tend to process items in the sentence initial position before those in the sentence final position, and they will process items in the sentence medial position last. That is after processing items in the sentence initial and sentence final positions. In other words, our natural tendency is to skip over the middle of sentences or utterances. The example below shows the Spanish subjunctive as it's used in the adjectival clause. This is a usage of the subjunctive that conveys meaning. Um, in Spanish, when the subjunctive is used in the adjectival clause, it's used when there's a hypothetical or an unknown referent. And this usage doesn't exist in English, and therefore the Spanish language is actually a little bit more precise in communicating meaning in this example. In Spanish, though, the subjunctive always appears in the subordinate clause in natural speech. We have a main clause and the subordinate clause, and the subjunctive then occurs right in the middle of the sentence where the students are least likely to notice it. When I teach the subjunctive to my Spanish learners, and I teach Spanish completely online, I alert students to their tendency to skip over the subjunctive forms because they occur in the middle of sentences. So in the example here, busco una casa que tenga 4 dormitorios, or I'm looking for a house that has 4 bedrooms, you can see that that subjunctive form appears right in the middle of the sentence where the learners are least likely to notice it. This slide shows how the information on processing strategies could be delivered to learners. For example, students are not explicitly told that this is the sentence location principle from Van Patten's model of input processing. Instead, I give the learners a brief explanation of the order in which their brains process items in sentences or utterances. I then tell my students to pay particular attention to verbs and verb endings that occur in the middle of sentences, which is where the subjunctive will normally appear in Spanish. Students are alerted that their natural tendency is to skip over items such as the subjunctive that occur in the middle of sentences. And they can avoid this faulty input strategy by paying closer attention to verbs and verb endings that appear in the middle of sentences. When creating structured input or structured input activities, it's really important to remove the lexical redundancies within the sentence because learners are going to process content words before they process inflectional morphemes when both encode the same meaning. In the example here, last week I worked 60 hours. Learners are going to process last week in order to understand the time reference of the sentence, and they will completely overlook the bound inflectional morpheme ed, which is redundant in this sentence. The main purpose of SI activities is to help learners make a correct form meaning connection. This is the connection between the grammatical form and the referential meaning that it encodes. So here you can see the bound inflectional morpheme ed in English encodes a past tense meaning. There There are two types of structured input activities: referential and effective. Referential structured input activities force learners to make a form meaning connection, and learners must attend to both form and meaning in order to answer items correctly. In addition, there is a right or a wrong answer. This enables the teacher or the researcher to determine whether students are attending to the targeted grammatical form for the meaning that it encodes. With effective structured input activities, learners communicate a belief or an opinion or an effective response as they engage in processing real world information that contains the targeted form. They're different than referential activities because with effective structured input activities, there's not a right or a wrong answer. Van Patten suggests having learners begin with perhaps two or three referential structured input activities and then following these with effective structured input activities. On this slide is an example of a referential structured input activity. The directions state: read the following statements and decide which activities your instructor did last night. Notice that the learners are not required to produce the targeted forms. Rather, they're forced to process the bound inflectional morphemes in order to answer the items correctly. So you'll notice here that some of the morphemes encode the present tense, others encode a past tense meaning, and learners must process the morphemes in order to understand the time reference of the input sentences because any lexical redundancies have been removed. With effective structured input activities, learners are exposed to the targeted form, but they focus primarily on meaning rather than on form to answer items. On this slide is an example of an effective structured input activity. The directions state: read the following statements about last weekend and decide if they apply to you. In this activity, all of the input sentences contain the first person singular preterite tense form in Spanish. The preterite is the past tense in Spanish. So students only need to understand the meaning of the input sentences in order to answer the items. Notice, though, that the input sentences in this activity are flooded with the targeted grammatical form. As with referential structured input activities, learners never produce the targeted form with effective structured input activities. However, they are doing something with their input. In this case, they're determining if the input sentences apply to them or not. I'm going to show you now 4 simple steps on how to create structured input activities. Step 1 is figuring out what processing problem you're going to address. Since processing instruction is a pedagogical intervention and not an instructional method, it is really not meant to be used daily. Instructors should bring in processing instruction when they anticipate that their students are going to have difficulty processing certain aspects of their input. As a Spanish instructor, I know that they're going to have trouble processing object pronouns in word order. I know they're going to have trouble processing the Spanish subjunctive in the adjectival clause. So I'm going to parachute in and bring in the processing instruction for these forms. Now, if you look at the principles and the sub-principles of the model, it can help you figure out when to use processing instruction. These are all listed for you in the Dig Deeper readings for Lesson 13. The second step in creating structured input activities is to ensure that the targeted form is meaningful. In order for processing instruction to be effective, the targeted form needs to carry meaning. For example, the inflectional morpheme for the future tense in Spanish, it's an accented A. That encodes a future tense meaning, so that accented A is meaningful. However, definite and indefinite articles in Spanish, they only convey grammatical information such as number and gender. They're not amenable to PI. So it's important you know what language you're teaching. You need to decide, is that targeted form meaningful? Step three is to remove all lexical redundancies in the input sentences. This actually elevates the communicative value of the targeted forms, and it forces the learners to attend to the form in order to extract meaning. Remember that students' natural tendency is to process content words over grammatical forms in their input. In the examples on this slide, the lexical items right now, today, at the moment, those need to be removed so that learners are forced into processing that ing morpheme in English in order to extract meaning. The final step in creating structured input activities is to adhere to the guidelines from Van Patten and Lee and Van Patten. The first is to present one thing at a time, to keep meaning in focus, to move from sentences to connected discourse, to use both oral and written input, to have learners do something with the input, and to keep learners' processing strategies in mind. According to the guidelines, learners should never be passive recipients of their target language input. Rather, they need to become actively involved with their input to increase the likelihood that they will process the targeted grammatical form. Learners can produce output during structured input activities. However, their production should involve alternative features rather than the targeted grammatical form. My favorite of these guidelines is having learners do something with the input. And some examples of having learners do something with the input include activities where learners have to maybe supply information or answer surveys. They can do matching or selecting from binary options. Ordering and ranking activities are good, or selecting alternatives. I'm going to conclude with some research on processing instruction. Um, Van Patten and Cadierno's 1993 seminal study is the most cited research article of all time in the journal Studies in Second Language Acquisition. And since 1993, there have been many, many studies in the PI strand. Please note that the studies that I have listed here, this is not an exhaustive list. Most of the research in PI has shown that processing instruction is superior to traditional instruction for interpretation tasks and equal to traditional instruction for production tasks. This is a very noteworthy finding because in all of these studies listed here, the learners who had processing instruction never once produced the targeted forms during their instructional treatments, yet they performed equally well on production tasks as learners who received traditional output based instruction. Some research has also shown that structured input activities alone are equally effective as full processing instruction for targeted forms that are simple. It's possible that the explicit explanation portion of processing instruction, it might not be necessary. In other words, that explicit explanation of grammar and the information on processing strategies, it might not be necessary for simple forms. The results have been more mixed for using structured input alone with complex forms. My 2012 study looked at processing instruction with online learners of Spanish for the acquisition of the Spanish subjunctive. I combined structured input activities with computerized visual input enhancement. And my input enhancement was word animation. I was trying to take advantage of the capabilities of the web based format. Most input enhancement has been like simple typographical techniques or using color. In my case, I used word animation. So when the students read the input sentences with that subjunctive form right in the middle of the sentence, I had the subjunctive form grow larger on the page, which kind of forced the students to notice that targeted form as they read those input sentences online. I found that Full processing instruction combined with that computerized input enhancement was superior to structured input activities alone without any of those computerized enhancements in a web based learning environment. In other words, what I found was that the most explicit and the most elaborate instructional technique, which was full processing instruction with visual input enhancement, was significantly better than the least explicit and the least enhanced technique, which was structured input activities alone without any computerized visual input enhancements. That's at least for online learners. But most importantly, I found that online learners expressed an overwhelming preference for processing instruction over traditional instruction. Since learner motivation is important for retention in an online course, techniques that students perceive as being highly beneficial, such as processing instruction, could be an effective way to increase retention and motivation in an online course. And that concludes my presentation for you this evening. At this time, I believe we have some time for questions, or maybe a few minutes.
Yes, we do. Thank you. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Victoria. So we're going to take some questions now. So Roman asks in the chat, he says, how many languages were used in the research study?
I'm sorry, you cut out there at the end. I didn't hear the end of the question.
I'm sorry. He said, how many languages were used in the research/study?
Which research study? The one that I did?
Yes, in your 2012 study that you presented.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure because I had quite a few studies listed on this page. My research study looked at the acquisition of Spanish with learners whose L1, whose first language was English. So I eliminated anyone who had other languages. I wanted to see, I was looking specifically at students who were acquiring Spanish as a second language. And I looked at the subjunctive in the adjectival clause, which is a form of the subjunctive that is meaningful. It carries meaning, which is one of the things that we need in order to implement processing instruction.
Okay, go ahead, Roman.
Yeah, thanks. I just have a quick question. I know that you mentioned there was you talked about the sentence structure, and then sometimes it's better to keep it simple and things like that. Well, in Russian, we do not follow a strict sentence structure, so it's more of a stylistic choice than a rule. So I'm not exactly sure how we can apply this to the Russian language in that sense. So that's my main question.
I wish I knew Russian. What I actually showed you was, in English, we have a much more fixed sentence structure, right? We have subject, verb, object. Whereas in Spanish, on the slide I showed you, we have subject, object, verb, subject. We drop the subject. Spanish is a pro-drop language. So what PI is saying is that students are going to process that first word that they see as the subject of the sentence. So in Russian, where does the subject appear?
It can appear anywhere, actually, so it doesn't really matter because phrases or sentences, they're just totally free. So that's one of the great things about Russian. It's also a curse, obviously, so for students especially. So yeah, we can kind of adapt it to how you translate it from English, but the problem is that there's really no structure. So if they read something outside of the course, they may get really confused about it. So yeah, and that's one of the problems. So
I think processing instruction can help you. I would surmise that your students are probably processing their input and assuming that the first word they see is the subject. If you find that to be the case, then you can use the information on processing strategies to remind your students that the first word they see may not be the subject, that the subject can in fact appear anywhere in the sentence, and that in English, their natural tendency is to process the first word as the subject, but that strategy is going to cause them problems in Russian. Do you think that might help?
Yeah, definitely. And this is something we usually tell our students that forget about this the sentence structure. It is not a strict rule. So yeah, we usually try to remind them about this and just kind of introduce them to the language. And some of them they still follow the English structures, which is okay for a beginner. But once you get a little bit more advanced, this is not going to work. So I also have another question. Uh, you mentioned that it's better to present grammar one part at a time. And again, in Russian, we have more exceptions than rules. So sometimes, presenting just one piece without actually adding some exceptions with it, along with it, would be kind of counterproductive because students would not be able to use that kind of grammar in the language. So, perhaps you have some suggestions for that.
Well, just keep in mind that as human beings, we're limited capacity processors. So everything that the students see in the second language is new information for them. So we can only process about 7 to 9 chunks of information at a time. Of course, as we practice and the material becomes more comfortable, we can add more and more. But at the beginning, when you're first presenting, I would caution you not to present too much. So maybe one item and one exception, and practice that, and let the students have practice with their input processing the information before we require them to produce it. The majority of the foreign language textbooks that I see require students to produce output immediately, and most of those activities, at least about 80% of those that I see in Spanish language textbooks, and I've seen a lot in my 25 years as a language instructor, are those mechanical drill activities. Students are just filling in that conjugated verb form, and they have no idea even what the rest of the sentence means. So I would suggest that you have the students, practicing one rule, maybe one exception to the rule, and practice comprehending the language, practice processing the language before they are required to produce those targeted forms. I do appreciate your questions, though. They're very good, and processing instruction can be applied to languages other than Spanish. Most of the research has been on with Spanish and French learners, I think some Italian learners, but it can also be applied to Russian.
Thanks. I just wanted to make a quick comment. Is that we use kind of similar techniques when we teach Japanese online. We're always telling the students, do you need a particle here? Which one do you think you need? We're always kind of asking, kind of guiding them through it with like little questions. And we use a lot of color coding in our sentence examples, to show, okay, look, here's this particle, or here's this, general time word, or here's an adverb, or here's the adjective, or whatever. So we use a lot of this in Japanese, especially. So I didn't realize that it was a thing. So
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, this is awesome.
Any other questions?
So in the chat, Stephen just mentioned, he said, this idea of the centrality of input is perhaps the most important part of our takeaway from PI. So he said, one more thing. He has one question for you, Victoria. He says, one would never include incorrect forms in the input of a PI intervention, correct?
Yes, I would never recommend showing a student an incorrect form. The whole point of processing instruction is to circumvent that incorrect input processing. We all know as language educators that students often process their input incorrectly. And the whole goal of processing instruction is to avoid those faulty input processing strategies. So you would never, in fact, show an incorrect form. I agree with that. And the centrality of input is very, very important. With online learners, they have multiple opportunities to interact with their input in the online learning environment. And this is the first and the most crucial piece because input is able to affect the developing linguistic system.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. Are there any other questions before we move on? All right.